There are people who cannot send a text message without reading it 4 times. They write it. They read it. They change a word. They read it again. They almost send it. Then they delete the whole thing and start over because something about it felt too much, too eager, too cold, too honest, too needy, too blunt. So they rewrite it until it sounds like nothing at all. And then they send it. And then they wait. And while they wait, they replay it. They wonder if the tone was off, whether they sounded stupid, whether the other person read it and quietly judged them, whether the silence means something is wrong. And if the reply takes longer than expected, that small delay can ruin an entire afternoon. Picture this. A woman is sitting in her parked car outside her apartment building. The engine is off. She's been home for 4 minutes, but she can't go inside yet. She just had dinner with friends. It was fine, by most measures. People laughed. She laughed. The food was good. But on the drive home, her mind started running. She replayed the moment she made that joke. Was it too much? She remembered the look her friend gave when she mentioned her job. Was that pity? She thought about how she talked too much in the first half, and then went quiet and wondered if anyone noticed the shift. She's sitting in the dark, going over all of it, checking for damage. Not because anything went wrong, but because something in her cannot switch off the scan. She will sit there for another 10 minutes, and then she will go inside and she will feel fine, and tomorrow she will do the same thing again. There are people who apologize before they speak, not after saying something wrong before. They'll say, "Sorry, this might be a dumb question," before asking anything. They'll say, "I don't know, maybe I'm wrong," before sharing an opinion they've thought about for years. They cushion their words before anyone has a chance to react, because somewhere inside them, they are already bracing for the response. There are people who rehearse conversations in the shower, not important conversations, ordinary ones. They run through what they're going to say, how the other person will respond, what they'll say back, what happens if the person reacts badly, how they'll recover. They prepare for social interactions the way other people prepare for job interviews. Because to them, every interaction carries an invisible risk. There are people who can sense the emotional weather in a room the moment they walk in. They scan faces. They notice tone shifts. They pick up on small changes in someone's energy. A shorter reply than usual, a different expression, a slight distance, and their nervous system responds as if a threat has been detected. They cannot fully relax until they know everyone around them is okay. There are people who feel guilty for resting, guilty for saying no, guilty for having needs, guilty for taking up space, guilty for wanting something different from what others expect of them. And most of these people, if you ask them, would tell you, "That's just how I am." They call it sensitivity. They call it conscientiousness. They call it being a caring person. But it isn't a personality trait. It is conditioning. And that distinction between who you are and what you were trained to become is what this entire video is about. Because here is what most people are never told. The need for approval is not weakness. It is not vanity. It is not immaturity. It is not something you can simply decide to stop. It is, for most people, a survival adaptation. Somewhere in your history, likely before you were old enough to understand what was happening, You learned something about the world. You learned that when people approved of you, things were calm, things were safe, there was warmth, there was connection, there was relief. And you learned that when people were disappointed in you, when they were angry, cold, withdrawing, or dismissive, something dangerous happened. The safety disappeared. The warmth was gone. And you were left in a kind of emotional freefall. And so, naturally, the way all intelligent creatures adapt to their environments, you learned what to do. You learned how to earn approval. You learned how to avoid disapproval. You learned to read people before they could judge you. You learned to shape yourself into whatever produced the safest response. You were not weak. You were adaptive. But here is the problem. That adaptation, the one that protected you then, is quietly running your life now. And most people have no idea. And here's what makes this so difficult to see. The more you seek approval, the less approved you feel. We'll come to that. But first, let's look at what this actually looks like, up close, in ordinary life. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in modern life. Because approval seeking doesn't look like what people imagine. It doesn't look like standing at a party desperate for compliments. It doesn't look obvious or embarrassing. It looks invisible. It looks like habits. It looks like you. It looks like the way you respond to a message when you're annoyed, but you type something neutral because you don't want to seem difficult. It looks like agreeing in a meeting with something you know is wrong because the person who said it is senior to you, and the discomfort of being visibly disagreeable feels like too high a social price. So you nod. And on the drive home, you feel a low, unnameable frustration that you file away as stress and never examine more closely. It looks like over-explaining yourself. Have you ever noticed how some people, when they make a decision, even a small one, feel compelled to justify it at length? They don't just say, "I can't make it." They explain every contributing factor, offer alternatives, apologize several times, and still feel guilty after hanging up. Not because they did anything wrong, but because they've been wired to believe that their choices require other people's approval before they're acceptable. It's not that they lack confidence, exactly. It's that deep down they don't feel entitled to simply want things, to simply decide things, without first running the decision past an invisible committee of imagined reactions. It looks like the way you feel after conflict, even when you were right, even when you had every reason to set that boundary, even when the other person was clearly out of line. You still go home and feel this slow, seeping anxiety. You replay it. You second-guess yourself. You wonder if you were too harsh. Because something in you needs the relationship to be smooth again. Something in you cannot rest until there is no perceived threat of rejection. It looks like the personality shifts. You are subtly different people around different people. Slightly more serious with the serious one. Slightly funnier with the funny one. More agreeable with the dominant one. More nurturing with the vulnerable one. It feels like social intelligence, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it's something else entirely. Sometimes it's the absence of a stable self. Sometimes it's the inability to be consistently you because you've spent so long becoming whatever was safest. And here is a contradiction worth sitting with. The more you adapt to everyone else, the more invisible you become to the people you most want to be close to. You perform belonging so skillfully that you never actually arrive. It looks like emotional monitoring. Some people walk into a room and they are, whether they know it or not, immediately tracking every person in it. They feel the atmosphere. They sense the moods. They notice who seems slightly off. And before they've even sat down, some part of their nervous system has already begun calculating. How do I make sure everyone here is okay with me? This is exhausting, chronically, structurally exhausting. But for many people, it feels so normal because they've done it their entire lives that they don't even realize how much energy it costs them. Think about a man who goes to work every day, performs competence all morning, performs ease at lunch, performs agreement in the afternoon meeting, performs calm when his manager is clearly in a difficult mood. He doesn't think of it as performing. He thinks of it as being professional, being good at his job, being a stable presence. But when he gets home and his partner asks how his day was, he has almost nothing left. He stares at the television and calls it tiredness. He calls it stress. He doesn't have a name for the specific depletion that comes from maintaining a self that is not entirely your own for 8 hours at a stretch. That is the cost of approval seeking that never shows up on any list. It looks like the need for reassurance. Not just big reassurance about big things, constant, small reassurance. After sending an email, after making a joke, after sharing an opinion, after expressing a feeling, there's always this quiet wait, this slight holding of emotional breath for the other person to confirm that what you did was okay. And when the reassurance doesn't come quickly enough, when the tone is slightly different, when the reply is shorter than usual, the spiral starts. And the spiral is almost never about the message. It's about the older wound underneath it, the one that learned long ago that a change in someone's tone meant something dangerous was coming. This is the texture of approval seeking in ordinary life. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It just quietly runs in the background, a constant, low-level monitoring system, shaping what you say, what you don't say, how you behave, how you present yourself, and what you're willing to risk. And the people who live inside this pattern often feel two things simultaneously. They feel deeply tired, and they have no idea why. But to understand why this happens, really understand it, not just intellectually, but in a way that finally makes sense of your life, you have to go somewhere most people would rather not. You have to go back, not to some dramatic moment, not necessarily to one traumatic event, but to something quieter and more pervasive than that. You have to go back to the environment where your nervous system first learned what safety means. Because here is something that doesn't get said enough. Children don't come into the world knowing who they are. They come in needing. They need food. They need warmth. They need touch. They need someone to be there. And the people who provide that, parents, caregivers, family, become, in the most literal neurological sense, the child's entire world. And this is important. Children are extraordinarily perceptive. Long before they can speak, long before they can reason, they are reading the emotional environment around them with extraordinary sensitivity. They feel tension. They feel warmth. They feel withdrawal. They feel unpredictability. And they learn to respond to these things not intellectually, but instinctively, viscerally. Because at that age, emotional connection is not just comfort, it is survival. When a caregiver is warm and responsive, the child's nervous system learns, the world is safe. My needs will be met. I can relax. But when a caregiver is emotionally inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes present, sometimes withdrawn, when love feels conditional, when it arrives after achievement and disappears after mistakes, the child's nervous system learns something very different. It learns, I am not automatically safe. I have to earn safety. And that is where it begins. Think about the child raised in a home where love was conditional on behavior. They got warmth when they got good grades. They got attention when they were well-behaved, quiet, agreeable. They got praise when they made the parent proud. But when they failed, when they were difficult, emotional, too much, not enough, the warmth retracted. The parent became disappointed, distant, cold. What does that child learn? They learn that love is a performance, that it is something you earn, not something you simply have. And more quietly, they learn that their worth is not intrinsic. It is conditional. It depends on what other people think of them. It depends on whether they are behaving in ways that produce approval. That child grows up. They are 32 years old now. They have a job they're good at and a life that looks reasonable from the outside. But every time they make a mistake at work, every time a manager gives neutral feedback, every time a project underperforms, they don't experience it as professional disappointment. They experience it as a verdict on their worth. Because that's what disapproval meant when they were 7. And the emotional brain, the one that runs these responses, doesn't automatically update when you get older. It runs the same code it always ran. The same code it installed when it was small and the stakes were enormous. Or think about the child raised around emotional unpredictability. A parent who was kind one day and cold the next, whose anger came without warning, who could shift from affection to fury in ways that made no obvious sense to the child, who turned the emotional climate of the home into something that had to be constantly monitored, because you never knew what mood you were walking into. That child didn't have a childhood, not in the full sense. They had a surveillance operation. Every morning began with a calibration. Is today a safe day or an unsafe day? Is the quiet downstairs a relaxed quiet or a tense quiet? Is the way he's holding his coffee casual or is something about to shift? The child learned to read micro-expressions before they were old enough to have a word for what they were doing. And they carry that radar into adulthood, into every relationship, into every room, into every conversation. Scanning. Always scanning. That's the adult who notices immediately when a friend's text feels slightly off. The one who detects coldness in a colleague's voice before anyone else in the room registers that the atmosphere changed. It's a real and remarkable sensitivity, but it came from somewhere painful. It was built as a survival tool, and it never got decommissioned. Or think about the child who was expected to be the good one, the one who didn't cause problems, the one who kept the peace, the one who understood from a very early age that their job in the family system was to manage other people's emotions. Don't upset your father. Don't stress your mother. Be quiet. Be helpful. Be agreeable. The child learns that love is contingent on smallness, on not being too much, on subordinating your own inner weather to serve everyone else's. And they grow up into adults who feel genuinely guilty every time they put themselves first, who apologize for having needs, who find it almost physically uncomfortable to disappoint people. Not because they are saints, Because the last time they tried to be fully themselves, the last time they expressed something real, needed something, took up space, the love in the room cooled. And that cooling, to a small person whose survival is emotionally dependent on the temperature in the room, was devastating. And so they stopped. They made themselves smaller and smaller until the smallness felt like personality. This is the architecture of approval addiction. It is not a character flaw. It is not something to be ashamed of. It is an extraordinarily logical response to an environment that taught you early and repeatedly that approval equals safety and disapproval equals danger. The tragedy is not that it happened. The tragedy is that most people live their entire adult lives running a survival program designed for a world they no longer live in. And what happens next only makes it worse, because if the home was the first training ground, school was the second. And school, in its own quiet way, finished what home started. Think about what school actually trains you to do. From the moment you walk through those doors at 5 or 6 years old, you are placed in a system that rewards specific things: obedience, conformity, correct answers, quiet, sitting still, raising your hand before speaking, asking permission to exist in the most basic ways, to use the bathroom, to move your body, to step outside. And you are evaluated constantly, publicly, by number, by letter, by ranking. Your worth, and that is exactly how it felt, even if no one said it directly. Your worth is measured and displayed and compared to other people's worth. And that number tells you, over and over again, in the most formative years of your life, are you good enough? Most people spent 15 years being trained to fear being wrong publicly. Think about that. The experience of giving an answer in class and being incorrect in front of everyone carries a kind of emotional charge that is completely disproportionate to what actually happened. Nothing dangerous occurred. No one was hurt, but the flush of shame, the drop in the stomach, the desperate wish to disappear. Those feelings were very real. And the brain remembered them. The brain filed them under. Speaking up is dangerous. And so the strategy that emerged was, don't risk it. Don't answer unless you're certain. Don't share an idea unless you're sure it will land well. Don't stand out in ways that might expose you to ridicule. Don't be too much. This is not cowardice. This is conditioning. This is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, learning from painful experiences to protect you from repeating them. But here is the cost, and it's enormous. You learn to suppress the instinct to think out loud, to explore, to be uncertain and visible simultaneously. Because being uncertain and visible was dangerous. And that lesson follows people into adulthood in ways they rarely connect back to a classroom. The professional who never shares an unfinished idea. The person who won't send a creative project until it's been revised 40 times. The adult who still, at 38, feels a flash of shame when they make a mistake in front of other people. They're not failing to be confident. They are being extraordinarily faithful to a lesson they learned in a room that smelled like chalk when they were 9 years old, and the whole class looked at them and they got it wrong. And then there is the social world of school, which is its own kind of laboratory. Children are placed in groups they didn't choose, with dynamics they don't understand, and asked to navigate extraordinarily complex social hierarchies while their identities are still forming. And what they learn through rejection, through inclusion, through being mocked or excluded or celebrated, shapes their understanding of who they need to be in order to belong. Because belonging at that age is everything. It is not a luxury. It is not a preference. It is a deep biological need. Humans are tribal. We are wired for group membership. And for a child, being rejected by the group doesn't just feel bad, it feels like annihilation. So the lesson learned is, read the room. Fit in. Be acceptable. Don't be weird. Don't be different in ways that cost you your social standing. The teenager who got mocked for their genuine enthusiasm, for the band they loved, the book they were excited about, the opinion they held with too much visible feeling, learns to dampen it, to perform cool, to never let the authentic reaction surface fully before it's been approved by the social filter. And gradually, across years, the authentic self gets tucked away. The parts that might provoke judgment get suppressed. The real opinions, the genuine reactions, the honest expressions, they get filtered, edited, made palatable, and the approval-seeking machine becomes more sophisticated. It is no longer just about survival. Now, it's about identity. The question shifts from will they hurt me to will they accept me, which, to a nervous system that has learned these are the same question, feels identical. And then came the phone. And everything that was already difficult became something else entirely. Because here is the thing about seeking approval before social media. It was painful, yes. It was limiting, yes. But it was also, in some ways, contained. You were rejected by the people in your immediate world. You were judged by a finite group. The feedback loop, the signal of approval or disapproval, was slower, more diffuse. There was space between experiences. You could go home and recover. And then, somewhere in the last 15 years, we built a machine and placed it in everyone's pocket that turned approval into a constant, quantified, publicly visible metric. Likes, views, followers, replies, story views, comment counts, share numbers, your social worth, gamified in real time. And the effect on people who were already running approval-seeking software in the background was not small. It was catastrophic. Think about what happens now. You post something, a photo, a thought, a moment from your life, and then you wait. And the waiting is not passive. It's an active, emotional experience. You check, you calculate, you compare the response to previous posts. You notice who interacted and who didn't. You wonder why this one underperformed. You wonder if the version of yourself you presented was good enough, interesting enough, likable enough. You have literally turned your existence into content that waits to be rated. There are people who delete posts because they didn't get enough likes within the first hour. Think about what that means psychologically. They had a genuine thought, a real moment, and because the external response was insufficient, they erased it. They decided retroactively that the moment wasn't worth existing publicly because the world didn't validate it enough. The thought was real. The moment was real. But without approval, it didn't feel real enough to keep. There are people who check their phone within minutes of posting, not because they're bored, but because there is a real, measurable anxiety in the waiting. The brain, which has learned to orient toward approval as a safety signal, cannot fully settle until the response comes. And when it does, the small relief, the brief relaxation of tension, that is not satisfaction. That is a loop completing. And like every loop, it opens again almost immediately. There is a specific kind of modern loneliness that no one quite names. It is the loneliness of being constantly visible and never truly seen. You post, people interact, the number goes up, but you are not known. You are performed, and the performance, however polished, however well received, cannot fill what you were actually hoping it would fill: the need to be understood without a filter. And so, you post again. You optimize again. You watch the numbers again. And the more you perform, the further you drift from the version of yourself that could actually be known. The more you seek approval, the less approved you feel. That is the trap. And it is extraordinarily well designed. And the comparison machine runs constantly now. Before, you compared yourself to the people in your immediate circle. Painful enough. But now you compare yourself to an infinite, curated stream of other people's best moments. You see someone's edited highlight reel, and your brain, which is not well designed for rational media analysis, processes it as reality. They are managing this better than you. Their life has a quality yours doesn't. And this comparison doesn't produce motivation. It produces a particular kind of quiet despair, a sense of perpetual inadequacy, a feeling that everyone else has received something you're still waiting for. And so you go back to the only strategy the brain knows: try harder, perform better, be more, earn more approval. And the loop continues. But there is something the loop will not tell you, something that social media, by its very design, cannot reveal. What's quietly building underneath all of this, underneath the performing and the monitoring and the managing and the approval seeking, is something most people never connect to any of this. Here is something that rarely gets said out loud. The nicest people in the room are often the angriest. Not visibly, not loudly, not in ways that are easy to detect, but quietly, consistently, in the spaces between the smiles and the helpfulness and the relentless agreeableness. There is a slow accumulation of resentment that has nowhere to go. Because here is what a life of approval seeking actually costs you. Every time you said it's fine when it wasn't. Every time you agreed with something you privately found wrong. Every time you helped someone while secretly resenting the ask. Every time you swallowed a reaction because expressing it felt too risky. Every time you performed warmth you didn't feel. Every time you stayed too long, gave too much, accepted too little. That doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Picture this: a woman who everyone would describe as warm, generous, endlessly giving. She's the person her friends call in a crisis. She shows up, she helps, she remembers things, birthdays, worries, the names of people's children. But late at night, alone, she feels something she cannot explain and would never say out loud. Resentment. Not toward any one person, toward something more diffuse, toward the shape her life has taken, always available, always accommodating, always calibrated around other people's needs. She has given so much of herself for so long to so many people that she is no longer sure what she would be without the giving. And the terrible irony is, she chose none of this consciously. She didn't decide to be this person. She was trained into it. The warmth is real, but the compulsion behind it, the inability to not help, the anxiety that arrives when she imagines saying no, that is not generosity. That is a survival mechanism that found a socially acceptable form. People pleasers are often described as selfless, as giving, as kind. And sometimes that's accurate. Sometimes the generosity is genuine and the boundary is a genuine choice. But often, more often than anyone admits, the people-pleasing is not selflessness. It is fear. Fear that if you say no, they will leave. Fear that if you express a need, you will be seen as demanding. Fear that if you disagree, you will lose the relationship. Fear that if you disappoint someone, the love, whatever version of it is available, will be withdrawn. Many people are not trying to be loved. They are trying to avoid abandonment. And that is a completely different thing. When you do kind things from that place, from fear rather than freedom, the dynamic is quietly corrupted. You are not giving freely. You are giving to manage a threat. And some part of you knows it, and some part of you resents it. There are people who spend entire days performing competence at work, performing ease in social situations, performing contentment in relationships that are slowly suffocating them, performing equanimity when they are actually overwhelmed, performing agreement when they are actually furious. And at the end of those days, they are not just tired in the normal sense. They are hollowed out. That particular exhaustion, the one that comes from managing your own presentation for hours on end, is unlike any other. Because you didn't just expend energy doing things. You expended energy being someone. You maintained a version of yourself that would produce acceptable reactions. You did the invisible labor of monitoring every interaction for signs of disapproval and adjusting accordingly. And you cannot tell anyone how tired you are, because explaining it would require revealing how much of what they've been seeing wasn't entirely real. The passive aggression that develops in chronic people-pleasers is almost always this: unexpressed resentment finding the only outlet available. Because if you cannot say, "I am angry," if that honest expression feels too dangerous, then the anger will find other ways out. It will leak through tone. It will emerge as forgetting. It will surface as an inexplicable coldness at the end of a day when everything seemed fine. It will arrive as a comment that was technically polite and unmistakably cutting. And the people on the receiving end of this cannot understand it, because on the surface, this person has never complained. They have never expressed a problem. They have been nothing but agreeable. What they don't see is the ledger that has been running privately for years. Every unspoken frustration, every suppressed need, every boundary that was never stated, every honest reaction that was edited out of existence. The anger was always there. It just had no voice. And here is the cruelest part of this dynamic. The people most afraid of rejection often reject themselves first, before anyone else has a chance to. They silence their own opinions before anyone disagrees. They minimize their own needs before anyone dismisses them. They make themselves small before anyone tells them to. They do the rejection preemptively, so that it hurts less, but it doesn't hurt less. And underneath all of this, underneath the resentment and the performance and the exhaustion, there is something even more painful. There is loneliness. The deep, structural loneliness of someone who is surrounded by people but genuinely known by none of them. Because to be known, you have to be real. And people who have spent their lives performing cannot fully access that. Every connection they have is slightly at a remove, because the version of themselves that other people know is the managed version, the edited version, the version that was calibrated for acceptance. And sometimes, alone, they sit with the terrible suspicion. If I stopped performing, if I dropped all of it, would anyone actually stay? And they never find out, because the performance never stops. And this sustained performance of a self that is not fully your own, leads somewhere that most people never connect back to approval seeking at all. It leads to the question of who you actually are. And for some people, that question has no clear answer. There is a particular kind of identity crisis that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It doesn't feel like a breakdown. It creeps in slowly across years, building in the space between all those small adaptations, all those moments of shaping yourself to fit, of making yourself more palatable, of editing out the parts that felt risky. And it arrives as a question that should feel simple. Who am I when no one is watching? For some people, people who have spent their lives as social chameleons, reading rooms and adjusting accordingly, that question produces not an answer, but a terrifying blankness. Because the truth is, they have been someone else for so long that they have lost clear access to who they actually are. Think about how this happens. You adapt for your parents, become the version of you that keeps the peace, earns the love, avoids the conflict. You adapt for your school environment, become the version that fits the social hierarchy, doesn't stand out in the wrong ways, earns enough approval to be safe. You adapt for your friendships, laugh at things that aren't quite funny, agree with positions you're not sure about, perform an energy you don't entirely feel. You adapt for relationships, become what they need, prioritize their comfort over your truth, make yourself smaller or larger depending on what seems to work. You adapt for work, present yourself in the way that earns approval, avoids criticism, generates the reactions that signal safety. And at some point, across all of this adapting, across all of these performances, each individually justifiable, each feeling like a reasonable social navigation, you have drifted very far from anything that could be called a center. You have become extraordinarily good at reading other people, and extraordinarily bad at reading yourself. There is a specific experience that approval-conditioned people describe, often with a kind of quiet shame. They don't know what they want. Not in the big existential sense, though often that too, but in the small daily sense. What do you actually want for dinner? What kind of holiday would you enjoy? What is your honest reaction to this film, this situation, this person, independent of what the people around you seem to feel? They hesitate. They look at the other person first. They calibrate. They have spent so long filtering their preferences through the lens of what will produce the best reception that the unfiltered preference, the raw, genuine one, has atrophied from disuse. It's still there, but it's quiet, and it doesn't trust itself. And then there is self-trust, or rather, its absence. Because here is what a lifetime of external validation does to your inner compass. It breaks it. If you have spent years, decades, outsourcing the question of, am I okay, to other people's reactions, you eventually lose the capacity to answer that question from within. You no longer trust your own perception. You second-guess your own judgment. You form an opinion and then immediately wonder if it's wrong, not because of logic, not because of new information, but simply because you're not sure other people would agree. Your own internal voice has been so consistently overridden by the search for external confirmation that it has grown quiet. And in that quiet, other people's voices have become disproportionately loud. You absorb criticism too deeply. You are too moved by disapproval. You are too dependent on praise. You have no stable floor beneath you, just the constantly shifting ground of what other people think. And you move through the world in a permanent low-grade anxiety, because you are, in a very real sense, always waiting for someone else to tell you if you're allowed to be okay. The more you perform, the less known you become. That is not a philosophical observation. It is a practical description of what happens to a life organized entirely around external approval. The relationships lack depth because depth requires honesty, and honesty requires the willingness to be disapproved of. The sense of self is fragile because it is built on other people's opinions, which change with their moods and circumstances and have nothing stable to offer. The life from the outside may look perfectly assembled, but from the inside, it has the quiet, hollow quality of a stage set. Solid looking, nothing behind it. This is not weakness. This is the logical outcome of a particular kind of conditioning applied consistently across the most formative years of a human life. But understanding that it is logical does not mean accepting that it is permanent. Because here is something true. The nervous system that learned one set of patterns is capable of learning different ones. The question is not whether change is possible. The question is whether you want it badly enough to tolerate the discomfort of finding out who you actually are. And that discomfort, let's be honest about this, is real. Dropping the performance, even partially, feels like stepping off a ledge, because the performance is not just a social strategy. For many people, it has become their entire sense of self. But there is another way to live, and it begins with understanding what it actually looks like. There is a particular kind of person that most approval-seeking people misread. They are not necessarily the loudest in the room. They are not always the most impressive. They don't urgently need you to think well of them. And that absence of urgency, that unusual quality of not needing anything from you emotionally, registers as a kind of magnetism. These people feel powerful not because of what they do, but because of what they don't do. They don't monitor your reaction when they speak. They don't backtrack when you look skeptical. They don't edit themselves in real time based on the energy of the room. They say what they mean what they say, and if you don't like it, they are genuinely okay with that. Not performatively okay, not defensively okay. Actually, calmly, biologically okay. And most people, when they encounter this quality, describe it as confidence. But what it actually is, underneath the word confidence, is something more specific. It is the capacity to tolerate disapproval without collapsing. Think about that for a moment. Not the absence of wanting to be liked. Everyone wants to be liked. That is human and healthy and does not need to be overcome. But the ability to want it and not need it. The ability to be rejected and not have your nervous system interpret it as a mortal threat. The ability to disappoint someone and let that be okay. The ability to be misunderstood and not feel an overwhelming compulsion to immediately correct their perception of you. That is what emotional freedom actually looks like. It is not loudness. It is not indifference. It is not the performance of not caring, which is just another performance and usually a fairly transparent one. It is the quiet internal certainty that your worth is not determined by this person's reaction, that their silence doesn't mean you failed, that their disapproval doesn't make you wrong, that their withdrawal is not the end of something essential. Here is something that approval-seeking minds rarely believe, but is consistently true. The people who have stopped performing are not less likable. They are more, because people can feel the difference between someone who is genuinely being themselves and someone who is calibrating their presentation in real time. We are exquisitely sensitive to this distinction even when we cannot articulate it. When someone is real with us, when they disagree without crumbling, when they set a limit without drowning in apology, when they express an opinion and hold it, we feel something in their presence that we call charisma or confidence, but which is actually just the rare experience of being with someone who is actually there. Fully there, not managing from a distance. The people who have built this capacity, and it is a capacity, it is something that develops rather than something you simply have or don't. They share something in common. They have, at some point, developed what might be called internal authority. They have moved the source of their approval from outside themselves to inside, not because they stopped valuing other people's opinions, but because they learned to hold their own opinion first, to check with themselves before checking with the room, to know what they think, what they feel, what they believe, and to let that be the primary reference point. This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily difficult for people who were never given permission to develop it. Because if you grew up in an environment where your internal sense of self was constantly overridden by a parent's disapproval, by a culture's expectations, by a school system that rewarded conformity, then the very concept of having an internal authority can feel foreign. Like a language you were never taught. But like any language, it can be learned. Here is what is important to understand about how this actually changes. It does not change by deciding to stop caring what people think. If you could simply decide that, you would have done it already. You don't choose your nervous system's responses. You don't consciously opt into the anxiety spike when someone goes quiet. You don't rationally decide to spend 45 minutes replaying a conversation. These are conditioned responses. They run below the level of conscious decision, and they don't respond to motivational speeches. They respond to repeated experiences of being okay. Small ones at first, expressing an honest opinion and discovering that the relationship survived, setting a boundary, and finding that the world didn't end. Disappointing someone and watching yourself endure the discomfort of their reaction and coming out the other side intact, not celebrated, not forgiven immediately, just intact. Realizing that their disappointment, however uncomfortable, did not actually destroy you. Saying something true, even imperfectly, and staying with the vulnerability of it rather than immediately backtracking. These small moments, accumulated over time, begin to revise the operating system. They provide evidence, experiential evidence, that the nervous system actually believes that disapproval is not dangerous, that rejection is survivable, that silence is not abandonment, that you do not need everyone to be okay with you in order to be okay. There is something powerful in noticing the difference between people who monitor reactions and people who monitor values. Approval-seeking minds monitor reactions. Constantly, involuntarily, they are running a scan. How am I landing? What do they think? Is this working? Am I okay? The reference point is external. The emotional weather of the people around you becomes the metric by which you assess your own state. And this is destabilizing, because other people's emotional weather changes for 1,000 reasons that have nothing to do with you. They are tired, they are distracted, they are in a fight with someone else. They are inside their own anxiety loop, and none of that information is available to you. So your nervous system, which has learned to interpret their energy as a report on your own performance, concludes, something must be wrong. Something must be my fault. People who have developed emotional independence monitor something different. They monitor values. Did I act in accordance with what I believe? Was I honest? Was I fair? Did I treat that person with the care they deserved? Did I stay true to what I know is right? That is an internal metric. It doesn't fluctuate with someone else's mood. It doesn't depend on whether they smiled at the right moment or texted back quickly enough. It is stable. And that stability, that small but profound shift from external reference to internal reference, is the foundation of everything else. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is a quiet reorientation. But over time, it changes the experience of being alive in a way that is difficult to overstate. Emotional independence does not mean emotional distance. This is a confusion worth clearing up. People who have developed internal authority are not cold. They are not indifferent to relationships. They are not armored against love or connection. If anything, they are more available for genuine connection. Because when you are not performing, you can actually be there. When you are not monitoring, you can actually listen. When you are not afraid of disapproval, you can actually be honest, which is the only foundation on which real intimacy can be built. The approval-seeking mind is actually less capable of true connection, not more, because every interaction is slightly filtered, slightly managed, slightly bent toward producing the safest response. Real connection requires a self that is willing to be seen, and you cannot be seen while hiding. At some point in a life organized around approval, there comes a moment, not always dramatic, sometimes very quiet, where something shifts. It might come from exhaustion, from realizing that you have done everything right, checked all the boxes, managed everyone's feelings carefully, and still don't feel at peace. That the performance has been flawless, and the reward, the sense of being finally, fully okay, has never arrived. That no amount of approval has ever made the need for approval feel smaller. Because it doesn't. That is the thing no one tells you at the beginning. Approval does not satiate the hunger for approval. It feeds it. Every validation creates a brief relief, and then the anxiety rebuilds, and the need intensifies, and the bar moves slightly further away. The loop has no exit, not from inside itself. The shift might come from loss, from the experience of something ending, a relationship, a job, a version of yourself, and discovering that you survived the disapproval, that the thing you feared was survivable, that the world you thought would collapse when you stopped performing stayed intact. It might come from a single honest conversation, from saying something true, finally, and watching the other person receive it, not with rejection, but with recognition. From discovering that the authentic version of you is not less lovable, but more. That what you were hiding was precisely what the other person needed to see in order to feel less alone. It might come from nothing in particular, just a slow, accumulating tiredness with the weight of constant management. A quiet voice that gets gradually louder. This is not sustainable. This is not me. Whatever brings it, that moment matters. Because in that moment, something subtle but permanent becomes possible. The beginning of taking your worth back. Not loudly, not all at once, not through some declaration of independence that reverses 15 years of conditioning in an afternoon, but slowly, through small acts of self-trust. The decision to share your actual opinion and let it land where it lands. The decision to say no without a paragraph of justification. The decision to let someone be disappointed in you and stay with the discomfort of it, not scramble to fix it, not collapse under it, but simply hold it and breathe. The decision to stop rereading the message 4 times, to send it as it is, to trust that who you are, the unpolished, unedited, uncurated version, is sufficient. Here is what changes when you begin to do this. The anxiety doesn't disappear. Not immediately. The old patterns still fire. The nervous system still sends the old signals. You still notice the impulse to monitor, to adjust, to manage, but something underneath it shifts. A small new voice that says, I don't actually need this person's approval to be okay. And that voice, quiet at first, gets gradually stronger with each small proof that it's true. There is a particular freedom that comes when you stop needing everyone to be okay with you. It is hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it yet. It doesn't feel like indifference. It doesn't feel like not caring. It feels more like spaciousness, like something chronically tight has finally been allowed to release. Because you have been carrying, for a very long time, the weight of everyone's emotional weather. You have been monitoring and adjusting and managing and performing. And when you finally put that down, even partially, the relief is physical. It is something your body recognizes before your mind does. You don't have to maintain this anymore. You were taught early and thoroughly that other people's approval was the price of your safety. You are not wrong to learn that. In the world you learned it in, it was true. In that world, that specific world with those specific people and those specific stakes, managing approval was the most rational strategy available to you. But you have not lived in that world for a long time. And the tragedy is not that you learned the strategy. The tragedy is that no one told you when it stopped being necessary. No one sat you down and said, the world has changed. You are no longer that child. You are no longer dependent on those particular people for your survival. You are allowed to exist without their permission. So this is that moment. You are no longer that child. The people whose approval once meant safety, they no longer have that power over you. Whatever that early environment taught your nervous system about what happens when people withdraw their approval, that lesson was accurate then. But the danger it was protecting you from does not exist in the same way anymore. You are allowed to say things that some people will disagree with. You are allowed to set limits that some people will not like. You are allowed to be quiet in groups, or loud, or uncertain, or confident, or inconsistent, or exactly who you actually are, without needing a committee of approval before any of it is acceptable. You are allowed to disappoint people. You are allowed to be misunderstood, and let that be okay. You are allowed to exist without performing. And here is the last thing, the most important thing. The people worth having in your life, The ones who are actually good for you, they don't need the performance. They don't need the managed version, the optimized version, the version that has carefully calculated the safest way to present itself. They want you, the unedited, sometimes uncertain, occasionally difficult, genuinely human you. And the only way to find those people, the only way to let them find you, is to stop performing long enough for the real thing to be visible. That woman sitting in her car outside her apartment building, replaying the dinner, searching for damage that isn't there, she doesn't need to do that anymore. Not because the world has become safe in some guaranteed way, but because she is more resilient than she has been taught to believe. Because the people worth keeping will stay even when she shows up without the careful management. And the ones who won't, they were never really there to begin with. Approval will always feel good. That is human. That will never fully change. And it doesn't need to. But needing it the way you once needed it, building your entire sense of self around whether it arrives, collapsing when it doesn't, shaping your whole life around its pursuit, that was never about love. That was about fear. And you don't have to live there anymore. The moment you stop needing permission to exist, not loudly, not perfectly, not all at once, but in the small, quiet ways that accumulate into something new, your entire relationship with the world begins to change. Not because the world changed, because you stopped being afraid of it.